Welcome back to the channel, everyone. We're going to be talking about another phone today and seeing whether or not it's still worth it. I have to get back to my roots. I have to start doing these videos again. I've been doing so many comparisons and everything, and I actually talked about the other phone that was released exactly the same time too, more so like the bigger brother of the Nexus 5X, which would be the Nexus XP. And I owned that phone for a little bit and I liked it. I never used it as a main phone, but the Nexus 5X was pretty much like the iPhone XR of that time. It was like the cheaper model of both of them, and it was skipping out on a couple features here and there, but overall it was still a pretty decent phone when it came out, but I would not recommend buying it anymore for reasons that are completely obvious. Now, this phone came out in 2015 and it was actually made by LG. Now, that is very, very important because LG phones have a very weird problem. Not anymore, more say, but at that time back in 2015, around this era, there were a lot of phones that were coming out by LG that had this boot looping issue. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind while I'm talking about this video, because I feel like the Nexus 5X and even the Nexus XP could have been those phones that people go back to and recommend even time and time again after. Even like the Nexus 7 tablet, that's such a great tablet. I think that, I don't remember what company made that, maybe it was LG, I don't know, but that tablet was such a nice looking tablet, and it was like super timeless. A lot of people were able to use it even after the fact, and the Nexus 5X could have been that type of phone. You know, the Nexus 5 is kind of like that, but the 5X, the 6P, these type of phones could have been that capability of being like, oh, if you need an older Android phone, the 5X is the way to go. But because of that boot looping issue and because of those lawsuits, these phones aren't necessarily worth it in 2020. I have to get that out of the way. I would not even recommend buying them or anything like that. However, I will say, if you're in the market for a phone, the best way to go would probably be like the Google Pixel 2 or the Google Pixel 3. Those are probably the bottom of the barrel I would go in terms of that. Even the original Pixel, if you want a bigger one, the Pixel 2 XL is probably the cheapest way to go. Those ones you can get for like less than $200 to $300 on Amazon, and I would highly recommend picking up those, and I'll leave links to those in the description below so you can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. But looking on the front of the Nexus 5X, now that we have that PSA out of the way, it had a 5.2 inch IPS panel. It was a 1080p panel, which is pretty nice, and I remember owning it, and there was something about this that made me so nostalgic of, it's like the Nexus 5 and the Nexus 4. If it had a baby, it would probably be the Nexus 5X, and there was quite a bit of bezel around it, but this was back in 2015, and a lot of phones at this time didn't really have, you know, small bezels and slim bezels and all that stuff. You know, they were still pretty thick, so I can't really give it too much flack there. You had a front-facing speaker, which is really nice. The biggest problem I think at the time was more so just it didn't really have an OLED display, but even at that time in 2015, there weren't like crazy amounts of, you know, people trying to push OLED displays on their phones like they are now. At this time, you know, we had the iPhone 6s that came out at the time, and with the Nexus 5X having a 5.2 inch display, that was actually a really nice thing. And this was the first time we saw Google push out two Nexus phones at the same time. Before this, it was the Nexus 6, and that was just one phone, and that phone was way too big, bro, to be honest. The Nexus 5X was a really good sweet spot. It was, you know, it felt good in the hands for the most part. It was built out of plastic for the, you know, most part, and it felt pretty cheap, but it had a good size to it, which is something that I really did like. Now there was the power button and the rockers on the right side, and I didn't really like them. Those buttons felt so cheap. I could not believe that Google would put those type of buttons on this thing, and the buttons didn't feel too good, but you know, you kind of got used to it over time, but that was kind of me nitpicking. Now, luckily, this phone had USB Type-C, which is really cool. You know, this was the first time I think on a Nexus phone we saw USB Type-C. And even at this time, there were still not a lot of phones that had that capability of doing USB-C. A lot of phones were still doing the other way around where they had that micro USB cable, but I think the Galaxy S6 came out at this time too in this year, so keep that in mind. You know, there was a lot of cool things that the Nexus 5X had that a lot of other competition didn't have. On the back, a single camera setup, and it had, you know, the fingerprint sensor below it, which is really nice. I like those physical fingerprint sensors on these phones. You know, the other ones where we don't have it, I don't even like the inbuilt screen ones. I like the ones that are on the back of the phone for some reason, but either way, that really pretty much covers it up on the outside. You know, no micro USB port, no IP certification, which even in 2015 that was a pretty big deal, you know, but we didn't get it on the Nexus 5X, which kind of sucked. But to kind of sum up the body, you know, the screen was pretty decent for an IPS panel, but the rest of the body felt a little weird here and there. The volume buttons didn't feel too good. You had the headphone jack, which is nice, but other than that, that really pretty much covers it up. Now, hitting on the software, this thing started off with Android 6.0 Marshmallow. It was eventually upgradable to Android 8.0 Oreo, and that's really where it stopped. You know, a lot of people, I guess, they didn't really go too much further than that. The sad thing is though is that this phone I think could have probably gone up to Android Pie if it really wanted to. I mean, this software was really, the hardware was there, you know what I mean, for the most part kind of. It's stock software, so there's not a lot of bells and whistles, but it's also not too bloaty, which is nice. However, like I've said before, and I'll say it again, I think my favorite software isn't necessarily even Google stock software. It's probably like OnePlus's Oxygen OS. That is probably one of my favorite softwares ever. They do a really good blend of everything that's kind of, going on with the ROM community and also the stock community, and kind of push those together to make one of the best software experiences ever for a stock Android phone. And they got a lot of that from their experience with Cyanogen. And the cool thing about the Nexus 5X is that there's still a lot of custom ROM capability behind this phone. A lot of people, keep this phone updated for the most part. I think I saw an Android Q ROM out for it recently, and we have Android 11 out now in the developer beta preview, so best believe that whenever the Android 11 drops officially, I'm pretty sure Nexus 5X is going to get a build too. So in terms of stock software support, it's completely outdated. It's not getting any more, software or anything like that, but it is still pretty capable for the most part. And that's something that I really do like about Google. They really do push initiative to support their phones for as long as possible. And that's something I really do like. So the Nexus 5X in terms of software got a thumbs up for me. It's outdated now, but it's still pretty decent. Hitting on the performance, this thing had the Qualcomm Snapdragon 808 chipset, a hexa-core CPU, and there were two different models, a 16 and 32 gig model with 2 gigabytes of RAM. And this is probably the dumbest part about this phone. They put a 16 as the base model and 32 gigs as that top tier model. That is something that makes no sense. This thing doesn't even have a micro SD card slot. So why would they put such low storage models on this phone? It makes absolutely no sense to me. Google needs to explain themselves. That's probably why this phone didn't do so well. It's probably because of those storage variants. That's insane. Even in 2015, I mean, iPhones were going up to 128. Even the Nexus 6P went up to 128. This one didn't go up to there. It makes no sense. But in terms of the performance, I think it was pretty decent. I think, it was a little glitchy here and there, and it wasn't perfect. But I think it got you from point A to point B. Like I said, the one advantage that it had was, having that stock software that really made this phone feel much faster than what it was. But even with, that it was pretty underpowered at the time when it even came out, and it was pretty glitchy throughout. I didn't really have a crazy good experience owning it. Even with the 2 gigs of RAM, that's pretty basic for a phone like this. I mean, you would need like 3 gigs or 4 gigs in the base minimum today. I know the Google Pixel 3 XL from last year had 4 gigs of RAM, and that's not really that much. So Google, took the initiative to increase the RAM the year after this, but 2 gigs of RAM is not a lot for 2020 standards, especially when we have apps that like Snapchat and Instagram that take up a bunch of RAM in the back end. And if you have a couple games in the background too, I mean, that's going to suck up a lot of your performance that you're going to take, especially a lot of that RAM. But if you're going from point A to point B, if you're just loading up documents, if you're just going to the Play Store, things like that, for the most part, you're going to be okay. But if you plan to do anything, extracurricular or anything performance heavy on a phone, you're probably not going to have a good experience with the LG Nexus 5X, if I'm being honest. So in 2020, the performance also doesn't really hold up anymore. And it's not, the Qualcomm's fault. It's not anybody's fault. It's just the way this phone was. You know what I mean? This phone just didn't have the strongest chipset. It had a budget chipset at the time. And in terms of performance, it doesn't really hold up that well in 2020. Like I said, it's okay, but it's nothing to brag home about anymore. So that pretty much covers it up there. Now, hitting on the camera, this thing had a single 12.3 megapixel camera on their back. You're able to do 4K videos on it, which is really nice. Laser autofocus as well. And like I've stated before, you kind of had a pretty decent camera on this thing. I think this was probably one of the best lineup on the Nexus camera scale ever. I think this phone probably brought it to where the Pixel phone was going to go to eventually. But I think this phone had to flop in order to make the Pixel line that much better. And even now their cameras, with the Pixel 4 and 4 XL are pretty substandard. I mean, they're okay. They're a little bit above average. But the Nexus 5X at the time, and the 6P included, really wowed people because a lot of people wasn't expecting that much, and they actually got that lot. So in terms of camera, I'll give it like a thumbs up. 5 megapixel camera on the front, and for the most part, I mean, it's a camera. They'll take photos, but definitely that back camera surprised a lot of people for sure. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 2,700 mAh battery, and this is probably the one area where the phone also just doesn't do that well in. A lot of people, like I said, had those boot looping issues, which could have been associated with the battery, could have been associated with some other defects in the hardware somewhere, probably more so that. But the battery, it wasn't even that big of a size battery, but at that time it was pretty decent because it was stock Android. It didn't really have a lot of back-end processes to worry about. So for the most part, this thing did an okay job in terms of the battery, but But really, other than that, it didn't really do it too much in terms of the favor that it had in terms of battery life. So there's no wireless charging on this thing either, which is really dumb. But in terms of the battery life, I'll give it like an average score, especially now in 2020, the battery's gone down a lot. I will give it below average for sure. Now to kind of sum up the video and to answer the question, like I've already answered it, is the Nexus 5X still worth it in 2020? Like I stated before, dude, I do not think this phone is worth it anymore. I think at the time it might have been worth it. It might have been a good phone, but especially now in 2020, it's completely not worth it. It's outdated. You're not getting any more software updates, and it's just not that good hardware. It's not fast. 2 gigs of RAM is very basic and not a lot for this day and age, and so I would not recommend buying a Nexus 5X in 2020. However, like I've stated before, I would highly recommend picking up a Pixel 2, Pixel 2 XL, or even a Pixel 3. Those are the best ways to go, and those are still pretty capable phones. They're still getting software updates, and I would highly recommend picking those ones up over this one for sure. So if you want to pick those ones up, like I stated, the links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. But that's pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel. All those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.